What I'm trying to explain to you is, come in.
You said you wanted to see me, Mrs. Walker.
Come right in.
Hello there. Good to see you again.
It's nice to see you.
You're awfully lucky, Mrs. Walker. Lovely little girl you have here.
Thank you. And Susan's the reason I asked you to drop down. She's a little confused, and I thought maybe you could help to straighten her out.
I'll be glad to.
Would you please tell her that you're not really Santa Claus? That there actually is no such person?
Well, I'm sorry to disagree with you, Mrs. Walker, but not only is there such a person, but here I am to prove it.
No. You misunderstand. I want you to tell her the truth. What's your name?
Chris Kringle. I'll bet you're in the first grade.
Second.
I mean your real name.
That is my real name. Second grade?
It's a progressive school.
Oh, it's a progressive school.
May I have this gentleman's employment card, please?
Yes, Mrs. Walker.
All right, everyone. Welcome to Brandon at Random Reviews. I am your host, Brandon Griffiths. Thank you for stopping by. I do appreciate it. If you like listening to a guy talk about one unsystematically chosen movie at a time in weekly episodes, then look no further. To keep up with the newest content, you can find Brandon at Random Reviews on most major video and audio platforms, as well as all popular social media sites. If you enjoy this, please like and subscribe. Those notifications they fucking brighten my day, you know what I'm saying? It's just, nothing warms my heart more than a good social media or video service notification. Today's movie is Miracle on 34th Street, released on June 11th, 1947, directed by George Seaton, written by George Seaton, he did the screenplay, and Valentine Davies did the story. For the producer, we have William Perlberg, and then for the score, we have composer Cyril Mockridge. For the cast, we have Maureen O'Hara, who is old-timey hot. She's not hot in a traditional sense of a modern leading lady, but she was a stone cold fox in her time, let's be honest. She plays Doris Walker, and she was also in The Parent Trap, the original from 1961, and that one had Haley Mills and that guy that I only know from The Parent Trap. This was a big favorite among me and my sister. My sister had this movie on all the fucking time, and for that reason, I wasn't as keen on the Lindsay Lohan version of the movie, but what can you do? She was also in McClintock, which is another family favorite. Everybody in my family loves McClintock. It's a John Wayne movie, and it's really funny. It's just ridiculous, and it's pretty fucking great. Then we have John Payne, who plays Fred Gailey, Edmund Gwenn, who plays Kris Kringle, Natalie Wood, who plays Susan Walker, and she actually went on to a fairly big level of stardom in her life. She was in the movie Rebel Without a Cause, which is one of the few James Dean movies ever, and that one's solid, actually. Like, I really like that. I actually saw a screening of it within the last few years, and it was really cool to be able to see that, that old of a movie in theaters, because it just feels like you never get the chance for that stuff. And she was also in the original West Side Story, which was recently remade by Steven Spielberg. West Side Story is a musical, and as I've mentioned before, I'm not big on musicals. I just don't think much of them. I mean, they're not my cup of tea, but it's actually, by musical standards, it's pretty decent. For casting notes, there are no casting notes. Unfortunately, with this being made in 1947, it didn't really help anything as far as getting fun tidbits and factoids for you, so sorry about that. For the plot synopsis, an elderly man gets a job as a Santa Claus in a department store and is praised by the public, but is met with much doubt, especially from the woman who hired him and her daughter, when he claims that he actually is Santa Claus. Okay, for taglines, all of these taglines listed on IMDb were just super fucking generic, but I wanted to clarify something. I will refer to almost all adult characters, with the exception of Chris, as more proper of a name. Like, for example, Mrs. Walker is what I call Maureen O'Hara's character. Her name is Doris, but they almost never call her that. They call her Mrs. Walker, so that's what I will be doing. Like, it was to the point that I kind of had to double check some of their first names because I just didn't associate a first name with them for some reason, and it was just a little fucking weird. Alright guys, let's just dive right into the plot of this fucking movie. So, the movie kicks off with such a spirited score, and a man named Chris, who has a white beard and white hair, hassles a clerk in a store window who is setting up the reindeer display incorrectly. exactly, as Chris says. Chris obviously takes it much more seriously than this clerk does. So Chris makes his way to the Macy's Thanksgiving parade and finds that the man playing Santa for them is fucking tanked. So he goes to tell Mrs. Walker, who is managing the parade, and she desperately asks Chris to just fill in, given his resemblance to Father Christmas, and the fact that she really doesn't have time to find somebody else. And because of the fear of disappointing so many children, Chris agrees and is an overwhelming favorite of the parade attendees. At some point leading up to this, you kind of start to think that maybe this fella might really be Santa, but then you just shake it off because that's crazy talk. Maureen O'Hara seems to have this fiery personality in most of her movies that I've seen, but she is, as I mentioned, a stone cold fox. Mrs. Walker goes home and finds that her daughter Susan has gone over to their neighbor Mr. Gailey's apartment to watch the parade, and we find out that Susan is an only child who has never met her father, and so it's just her and her mom. Mr. Gailey comments on the parade and quickly learns that Mrs. Walker has taught Susan not to believe in fairy tales or supernatural stuff at all. Mrs. Walker comes over and introduces herself to Mr. Gailey, and he discusses how Susan feels about fantasy concepts, and she defends the beliefs she's instilled in her daughter. In a not so subtle way, Mrs. Walker kind of explains that she feels like this because of how Susan's father treated her. Susan then quickly asks her mother if Mr. Gailey can come to their dinner at their apartment, and after some polite back and forth, Susan actually just reveals that Mr. Gailey put her up to asking her mom to invite him. And of course, the mom relents and just says, yes, okay, that's fine. Obviously, you fucking want to go and you got a thing for me, so whatever. In the locker room after the parade, Chris befriends a younger guy named Alfred, and they bond over the experience of portraying Santa Claus. Mr. Shellhammer, who works with Mrs. Walker, approaches Chris about pushing certain overstocked Macy's inventory on children who are undecided about what they want, and Chris thinks that this is pretty fucking despicable. At the store, Chris visits with a boy who wants a fire truck of some sort, and despite the kid's mother saying that no one has them in stock, Chris still says that the boy will get the truck. The mother immediately confronts Chris about this, and Chris assures her that there is another department store that carries the truck, and the woman is baffled by this strange behavior of Macy's just sending customers to competitors, and she cheerfully raves about it to Mr. Shellhammer. Of course, Mr. Shellhammer doesn't know what to make of the occurrence. He sees the appeal for the customers, obviously, but he's concerned about the risk of sending them elsewhere, and ultimately doesn't really know what his boss, Mr. Macy, will think. Mr. Gailey takes a skeptical Susan to see Chris, despite knowing Mrs. Walker wouldn't approve, and Susan expresses her doubts to him about who he really is, and Chris lets her pull on his beard, and she can't believe that it's real, and I'm like, this girl, she seems pretty smart, like she's never encountered a dude with a beard at all. Anyway, Chris can't get Susan to share what she wants for Christmas because her mother can provide anything that she wants. Mrs. Walker comes and sees what's going on and intervenes and scolds Mr. Gailey for not respecting her wishes. And now, on to one of my favorite parts of the entire fucking movie. Honestly, it might be the best. So, Susan is standing there waiting for her mom to get done laying into Mr. Gailey, and she sees a young Dutch girl approach Chris with her adoptive mother, and the girl claims that she believed that Chris was the real Santa when she saw him and asked to come see him, but the adoptive mother really fears that the girl is going to get crushed when the language barrier kicks in between her and Santa, and it's going to prevent verbal communication that she seems to be anticipating. But wouldn't you know it, our boy Chris just launches into a full-on Dutch conversation with the girl, and she is just overwhelmed with joy. Susan has been watching the whole time and is just beyond bewildered about what she has just seen. Later on, Mrs. Walker tries to convince Susan that Chris being able to speak another language does not make him the real Santa, but Susan is starting to believe anyway. Mrs. Walker asks Chris to come tell Susan that there's no such thing as Santa Claus, and Chris respectfully disagrees and asserts that he is actually totally that dude. And after looking at his employment card, Mrs. Walker begins thinking Chris is probably kind of fucking nuts, and she politely tells him that his services are no longer needed at the store. She gives him some bullshit line about, we had some guy who used to play Santa Claus for us came and he really wants the job, so we felt it was something we owed to him. Mr. Macy talks to Mrs. Walker and Mr. Shellhammer, among others, about how he wants to carry out a plan inspired by the whole Chris directing customers to competitors thing in order to be looked at as a more helpful store. Of course, Mrs. Walker tells Mr. Shellhammer after the meeting that she actually fired Chris, and Shellhammer convinces her that they should have Chris examined by a mental health expert, a guy named Mr. Sawyer, by the way, to allow them to keep him on and also to prevent any legal backlash for wrongfully firing him. Chris is excited to hear Mrs. Walker's bullshit explanation about why Chris can now come back and is immediately suspicious about the examination that she brings up, but he's taken them many times before and already knows what to do and what to expect. Mr. Sawyer, the mental health guy, is a very unpleasant man, and as he talks to Chris, he obviously gets the answers to everything. It's all correct, and Chris is basically just able to complete the physical tasks as well, but he's also noticeably bored with this whole experience. It's all too familiar, and he talks to Mr. Sawyer about Mr. Sawyer's personal life and behavior as well. And afterwards, Mrs. Walker has brought in Chris's doctor from the old folks' home, I believe, Dr. Rogers, and Mr. Sawyer comes after the examination to tell them that Chris gave the correct answers, but he argues that Chris was distracted the whole time and kept changing the subject, and it is his expert opinion that Chris ultimately failed the examination. Now, I want to make a note in case I forgot to say it in my notes later on. Mr. Sawyer is Mr. Sawyer because he's not Dr. Sawyer, okay? He is not a licensed psychiatrist. He is not that guy at all. He is just some dude who is like kind of well versed in some things, and it would probably be limited to whatever Macy's needs from him. Mr. Sawyer believes that Chris should be institutionalized, but Dr. Rogers knows Chris well and argues that even if what Sawyer says is true, Chris is a kind-hearted and not dangerous guy, and so it's just that he's adamant about the existence of Santa Claus. Like, who gives a fuck? So after the discussion, Mrs. Walker doesn't feel any better about the situation, so Dr. Rogers suggests that to prevent any incident, he could stay with someone in the city that one of them knows, and he could just ride with someone to work and hopefully mitigate any potential issues. Mrs. Walker suggests that Mr. Shellhammer rent out his spare room to Chris, and he decides the only way to make this happen is to get his wife fucking plastered on after dinner martinis to just to agree to it. Like she has to be that fucking gone out of her mind to even entertain this idea. And Mrs. Walker will simply have to have Chris over for dinner until this can be arranged. At the Walker residence, Chris talks to little Susan about loosening up and playing with the other kids that she knows, including using her imagination to have fun like they do. I mean, she just sounds like she's kind of an outcast with the other kids. Like, not necessarily that they like dislike her or something, but she doesn't like want to play these fun games that they're playing. She wants to play real type things, you know? Mr. Gailey is included in the dinner plans and overhears the talk about needing to get Chris to stay with someone and offers to let Chris stay with him. Right after this discussion, Mrs. Walker answers a call from Mr. Shellhammer as expected, and his wife is fucking trash, and he puts her on the phone and she offers to let Chris stay with them, and Chris thanks them very much, but says that he's just staying with Mr. Gailey, and that's a plan that they came up with. And Mrs. Walker is pretty fucking TO'd about the whole thing. Like, she went to a lot of trouble to make that happen, and it was just for nothing. So, later that night, Susan is going to bed, and Chris is asking her about what she wants for Christmas, and she finally caves and says she wants a house with a yard. And although Chris tells her that this isn't super realistic and it's a lot to ask for, for, she insists that if he doesn't get it for her, she'll just refuse to believe that he's really Santa, which is, what, extortion? Is that the word I'm looking for? I mean, fuck. That's fucked up, all right? Chris and Mr. Gailey are going to bed, and they devise a plan to divide and conquer, with Gailey focusing on Mrs. Walker and Chris giving his attention to Susan, in hopes of just winning the two girls over that way. There is a scene with the biggest Macy competitor, Gimbals, discussing how bad Macy's is making them look with their Goodwill campaign, so Mr. Gimbal proposes that they copy them in multiple of their major stores in the country. Chris and Alfred from earlier in the movie meet for lunch, and Alfred is distraught after having had many sessions with Mr. Sawyer, and he's just feeling really guilty because Sawyer told him a bunch of shit to make him feel bad about himself. Like, I mean, he made him think that he hates his father, even though he didn't think he had any reason to hate his father. It's fucking terrible. I mean, Mr. Sawyer, I'm just gonna say it right now. This guy's a big piece of shit, okay? That's the continuing narrative of this movie is Mr. Sawyer is a fucking bag of dicks. Okay, so this of course makes Chris furious, and he goes to confront Sawyer, criticizing him for not being a licensed psychiatrist and not having the right to examine Alfred like he has been. Sawyer refuses to admit to any wrongdoing and asks Chris to leave, and Chris decides the only way to deal with him is to hit Sawyer on the head with his cane, and Mrs. Walker and Mr. Shellhammer witness this interaction through the office window, and they come to like see if everybody's okay or what's going on. So although Sawyer was not overly fazed by the knock on the head, it's like he realizes that they're coming and he's laying back in this chair and he like gets this like smirk on, and then he just pretends he's knocked out, and it's what a fucking douchebag. And then when he pretends to come to later on, he convinces the two of them to force Chris to go to Bellevue Hospital, which I guess is like pretty much always a psychiatric hospital. I mean, Bellevue is like synonymous with that. Mr. Gailey gets a call from the hospital and he finds out Chris deliberately failed his examination when he arrived and is now being committed. So Mr. Gailey goes to see him and he points out that Chris is being selfish, and many people actually do believe in him and count on him, so they begin trying to work to get him out of there. Turns out Mr. Gailey is actually a lawyer and files a lawsuit on Chris's behalf, and they arrange a hearing regarding Chris's experiences, and Sawyer stops Mr. Gailey out in public one day to let him know that Macy's really wants to avoid publicity. It's very blunt, like he's just like, we don't want publicity. And then Mr. Gailey gets this like fucking super duper happy look on his face, and he's like, yeah, you know what? That's a good fucking idea. What if I did do that? What if I just got some fucking publicity? You know what I'm saying? I could sway public opinion and shit. I mean, why not? Now, I'll just say they basically padded the runtime for this movie with a bunch of nonsense with this judge for the case. It's like you see how his grandkids are acting toward him now that he's like sitting on the case talking about whether or not Santa is real, essentially. I'm not going to get into that whole portion of this story very much because it does feel very much like filler. So the hearing begins, and Chris maintains his story, and he even asserts that he is indeed Santa Claus, and even clarifies that he's not confused about what that means or what they're suggesting. Mr. Gailey asserts that Chris cannot be insane if he really is who he says he is, and thus he intends to make the case that Chris actually is Santa. After making a big show at court, Mr. Gailey tells Mrs. Walker about leaving his firm after they reacted negatively to his antics in court. Eventually, Mr. Gailey presses the issue in court, and Mr. Macy is actually swayed pretty heavily by the bias of concern for the ramifications of saying that there is no Santa, and he bases his testimony on these concerns. Like, you see these things, they show, like, it's newspaper headlines that he's seeing in his mind that are going to come up, and it's just everybody's going to say the Santa thing is a fraud and blah, blah, blah. So Mr. Gailey eventually calls the prosecuting district attorney's young son to the stand, and the boy claims that Chris is Santa and that his dad actually told him so. Mrs. Walker is explaining what's going on to Susan, and They both bask in the glow of their newly found faith that Chris actually is Santa, so Susan decides she's going to mail a letter to Chris to make him feel better. At the post office, where they're sorting mail, one of the sorters finds this letter that Susan sent to Chris, and, he calls a guy over and he's like, "What's going on with this? Like, who is this? Like, I've seen Santa Claus letters before, but this one's got an address and all this stuff. Like, what's up with this?" Once he figures out, oh, this is a real dude, he comes up with the idea of how nice it would be to use that as an option to get rid of all of their excess Santa mail that's just hanging around. So they just decide in that moment that all the Santa mail is going to go to Chris now, and it's going to be treated as his mail, even though Santa Claus is what is on all the letters and there's no address. And then Kris Kringle is what's on Susan's letter and there is an address. But let's not dig into it, guys. This is a fucking Christmas movie. This is a feel good, awesome movie. So I don't even want to fucking go there. Meanwhile, Mr. Gailey shares his concerns with Chris about not really having any concrete evidence. But almost immediately, when addressing the court, he reads from this book and shares many facts about the United States Post Office, which is an official branch of the federal government. I say facts, but he actually suggests he believes it to be a highly functional and efficiently run organization, and that is just patently absurd. Like, don't go there with that. Like, no one believes that. The people that run the post office don't believe that. Why are you saying this? Everyone agrees on the standard of the post office. The judge, the district attorney, they all agree to the merits of this branch of the federal government, but they don't see what the point is. And basically, Gailey has presented these like 3 sample letters that came to Chris from the post office that were addressed to Santa Claus, but everybody seems to agree that that basically proves nothing. It's not enough of a sample size. The judge demands that Gailey put the other examples that he has on his desk, and he keeps like pounding on his desk, and like they open the doors in the back of the courtroom and a ton of postal workers come in with heaping bags of letters and they just dump them on the judge's desk. And the judge clears all the piles of letters to rule that Chris really is Santa because the US government says he is. Say what you will, I mean, if I get mail from the wrong person, I don't get to say that I'm that person. Now, I don't know how things worked in olden times. Maybe this is the way of doing things. It's hard to say. I'm just telling you that doesn't make a ton of sense to me, but I'm going to let it go cuz this is a great film, okay? So, the next day is Christmas morning and there's a gathering where Chris invites the Walkers and Susan eagerly searches for her house, but she's disappointed that there wasn't even like a fucking letter explaining where to get the house, all this stuff she's just got in her mind. It's like, oh, it's got to happen. So Chris comes and he apologizes to Susan, and she says that he really must not be Santa, but Mrs. Walker insists that she must believe, and Chris gives Mr. Gailey and Mrs. Walker directions for a faster route to wherever it is they're going. Suddenly, when Susan and the couple are driving and she's muttering in the back seat about basically being forced to believe in things that are silly, she suddenly looks and cries out that they have to stop like right fucking now. And they pull up to this house. Susan begins running up, and long story short, it is the house that Susan asked Chris for, and they see what looks to be Chris's cane leaning in a corner, and they can't fucking believe it. But hold on, like, there's a moment, and it is like such an old-timey thing, but like, in this movie, in this moment when they're in this house, Mr. Gailey and Mrs. Walker have a kiss, and it's like one of those like gnawing at your face, like really violent kisses. And it's like, it's such an old movie thing. Like, you don't see it in any kind of movie anymore, really. I mean, nothing recent. However, I do want to say I would have really liked for this movie to just carry on for maybe another half hour and explain the process of Mrs. Walker and Mr. Gailey getting the house rightfully transferred to their official ownership. But instead, Instead, we roll credits. Praise for this movie. This movie really does hit all the right notes for me. It's a perfect Christmas movie. It's short and to the point and has a lot of memorable moments in it. The cast is all spectacular and the performances really come together well. The way they show the likely realities and occurrences that would have happened as a result of these events, if they happen in real life, really makes the story resonate with the audience. For criticism, I don't know. I mean, that Mr. Sawyer is a big douchebag, but honestly, like, I love those, like, hateable characters. They're so fucking awesome. Like, you just have to respect those performers that are, like, putting on that performance where it's like, I really believed that that guy was a piece of shit. Like, I thought he was a douchebag, and I don't know that I've seen him in anything else that I can think of, but he's great in this. He's a great actor. I mean, he does a great job. So, all right, so for trivia, the Macy's Thanksgiving parade sequences at the beginning of the movie were filmed live on location during the 1946 parade. Maureen O'Hara said, "It was a mad scramble to get all the shots we needed, and we got to do each scene only once." She went on to mention that it was very cold that day, and she envied John Payne and Natalie Wood, who got to do their scenes inside looking out a window. Studio head Daryl F. Zanuck insisted that the film be released in May due to the popularity of going to the movies in times of warmer weather. The studio rushed to promote the film for the early release while doing their best to keep its Christmas setting and themes a secret. The official trailer for the film featured testimonials from actors who were not even in the cast, as well as scenes that did not feature Edmund Gwen's Kris Kringle character at all. They just didn't want any kind of Christmassy stuff. But I mean, like, really, for that, like, it's so frustrating because it's like, I'd like to think that they would not do that today. I mean, I guess there were quite a few years within my lifetime, even, that it was big to release a Christmas type movie in the summertime, like middle of the summertime, and not even necessarily like full on Christmas movies, but these set at Christmas type movies where you're seeing things that are being referenced or being, you're surrounding yourself with. It's like, Christmas trees and shit like that. It's just, I mean, Maureen O'Hara had recently moved back to post-war Ireland at the time and was reluctant to take the role, but was won over ultimately by the script. Both Macy's and Gimbel's were approached by the producers for permissions to have them depicted in the film. Both wanted to see the finished film before they gave approval, and if either of them had refused, the film would have had to be extensively edited and reshot to eliminate the references. Fortunately, at the test viewing, both were pleased with the film and gave their permission to use their properties. Edmund Gwenn actually gained 30 pounds to play Chris, and that's my last trivia item, but that's fascinating, but only in that I know that that's a lot of weight. However, I haven't seen anything with Edmund Gwenn in it, so I don't have anything to compare this to. So, on to info and ratings. We have a runtime of 96 minutes. This movie was approved by the Production Code Administration. Budget $630,000. Opening weekend $2.8 million. Worldwide gross $46.3 million. IMDb rating 7.9. Letterboxd rating 3.8. Rotten Tomato critic score 96%. Rotten Tomato audience score 87%. Personal rating 5 out of 5 stars. I don't give a shit. I fucking love it. It's a classic. I didn't care for that little remake from the 90s with Mara Wilson. I don't have anything against Mara Wilson in particular, but it's just the tone of that movie didn't feel right to me. But I could be wrong. I could be way off base and remember it wrong. It's been a while. So, all right, everyone. Well, I appreciate you tuning in today. I hope you like the show. Give me a like, give me a follow, give me a subscribe, whatever you got to do. Tell your friends, tell your relatives, tell people you don't know, tell coworkers, tell people that you haven't spoken to in decades, and just extend an olive branch so that you can recommend my podcast to them. It would mean the world to me. Okay. So, all right, everyone, have a good rest of your day. Bye now.
I understand the post office receives thousands of these letters every year.
I have further exhibits, Your Honor, but I hesitate to produce them.
Oh, I'm sure we'll be very happy to see them.
Yes. Produce them, Mr. Gailey. Put them here on my desk.
But, Your Honor...
Put them here on the desk.
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, every one of these letters is addressed to Santa Claus. The post office has delivered them. Therefore, the Post Office Department, a branch of the federal government, recognizes this man, Kris Kringle, to be the one and only Santa Claus.
Since the United States government declares this man to be Santa Claus, this court will not dispute it. Case dismissed.
I've got to get that football helmet.
Thank you so much, Your Honor, and a very Merry Christmas to you.
Thank you, Mr. Kringle, and the same to you.